In 1942, the skies over the Pacific were filled with doubt, fear, and fire. For the men of the U.S. Navy, the Grumman F4F Wildcat was their only shield, yet many pilots gave it a grim nickname, the Flying Coffin. On paper, it was slower, heavier, and far less maneuverable than Japan's sleek A6M Zero, a fighter already celebrated as the deadliest bird in the sky. To most Americans, the Wildcat seemed like a stopgap, an outdated machine doomed to be outclassed in every encounter. But what few realized at the time was that across the ocean, Japanese aviators and analysts were watching closely. At first, they mocked the Wildcat as clumsy and second-rate. Yet as the battles unfolded, from Coral Sea to Midway, from Henderson Field to the long grind of Guadalcanal, something began to shift. Reports whispered of an enemy fighter that absorbed punishment, refused to die, and returned with fangs bared. The shocking truth wasn't simply in the machine itself, but in what it revealed about adaptation, psychology, and the way America fought its war in the air. This is the story of the F4F Wildcat, not as America saw it, but as Japan came to fear it. As the storm clouds of war gathered over the Pacific in 1941, America's naval aviation found itself standing at a dangerous crossroads. For years, U.S. carrier decks had launched the stubby Grumman F4F biplane, a relic of an earlier era. Its successor, the newly minted F4F Wildcat, had only just begun to enter service when the world changed overnight at Pearl Harbor. With its squat fuselage, narrow landing gear, and unremarkable speed, few believed it could hold the line against Japan's fast-rising naval power. The contrast could not have been sharper. Across the ocean, the Imperial Japanese Navy had spent a decade perfecting its air arm. The crown jewel was the Mitsubishi A6M Zero, a masterpiece of engineering that sacrificed armor and self-sealing fuel tanks for extraordinary agility and astonishing range. On paper, it outclassed the Wildcat in nearly every category that mattered in a dogfight. And yet, in the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the Navy had no alternative. The Wildcat was the only fighter available to fly cover over America's remaining aircraft carriers, the last true offensive weapon left to the Pacific Fleet. If the Wildcat failed, those carriers would be naked against Japan's experienced naval aviators. Thus, with the nation still reeling from disaster, the fate of the Pacific War came to rest on a fighter that looked, to many, hopelessly outmatched. What followed would prove that survival in the air depended on far more than specifications written on paper. To understand why so many dismissed the Wildcat at first glance, you only have to look at its numbers. Powered by a 1,200 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp radial engine, the F4F could reach a top speed of just 318 miles per hour, respectable but noticeably slower than the Zero's 331. Its wings spanned 38 feet, its body stretched just under 29, dimensions compact enough for carrier decks but limiting in maneuverability. Fully loaded, it weighed nearly 7,952 pounds, a lumbering heavyweight compared to the Zero's featherlight 5,313. Yet hidden in these apparent disadvantages lay the Wildcat's true character. Where the Zero was delicate, the Wildcat was stubborn. Its armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks, absent in early Zero models, meant it could soak up punishment that would send its rival plunging in flames. Its 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns might lack the cannon punch of the Zero, but they offered devastating sustained firepower. In a drawn-out exchange, the Wildcat could spit a wall of lead long after the Zero's guns fell silent. Even the machine's voice told its story. Japanese pilots soon learned to recognize the Wildcat by the primal, throaty growl of its radial engine, a sound entirely different from the Zero's high-pitched whine. It was as if the American fighter announced its presence with a snarl, daring opponents to test its resolve. What looked ungainly on paper was in fact a machine built in the image of its maker, Grumman, nicknamed the Iron Works. While Japanese engineers pursued elegance, Grumman valued toughness. That difference would prove more decisive than anyone yet imagined. The Wildcat's rugged character didn't come easily. In fact, its very existence was nearly derailed before the war ever began. Grumman's first design, the F4F-1, was a biplane, a last gasp of an aging era. Only later did engineers reimagine it as a monoplane, the F4F-2, trying to keep pace with rapid advances abroad. But even then, the Navy remained skeptical. Early prototypes revealed alarming flaws, spin tendencies so violent that they cost a test pilot his life. In 1938, whispers circulated that the entire program might be canceled, complicating matters, each demand for survivability. Armor plating, self-sealing tanks, heavier armament, added weight the airframe could barely carry. Performance sagged. Critics asked whether it was wiser to scrap the Wildcat and wait for Grumman's next project, the far more advanced A6M Hellcat. But that was years away, and time was one thing the Navy no longer had. Grumman pressed on. The company's philosophy was simple: build machines that brought their pilots home. Wildcat production expanded, with variants adapted not only for the U.S. Navy and Marines, but also for Britain's Royal Navy, where it flew under the name Martlet. Each new version strained Grumman's assembly lines, yet each also refined the fighter into something sturdier, simpler, more battle-ready. By early 1941, the Wildcat's shortcomings were plain. It would never match the Zero's speed or agility. But Grumman's engineers, unwilling to chase impossible numbers, doubled down on what the Wildcat could do: endure punishment, deliver firepower, and keep flying when lesser aircraft fell from the sky. That decision would change the course of the Pacific Air War. If the Wildcat could not beat the Zero in raw performance, then victory would have to come from somewhere else. That somewhere arrived in the form of tactical innovation. One man, Lieutenant Commander John S. Jimmy Thatch, studied combat reports and intelligence on the Zero's flight characteristics. What he discovered was both simple and revolutionary. The Zero's dominance lay in its turning ability. Neutralize that, and the playing field would change. His answer became known as the Thatch Weave. Two Wildcats would fly side by side, weaving back and forth across each other's path. If a Zero latched onto one fighter's tail, the maneuver would swing the second Wildcat into perfect firing position. It was an elegant solution, born not of superior technology, but of teamwork and discipline. To Japanese analysts, such tactics initially seemed dishonorable. Evidence, they thought, of American cowardice, refusing to face them one-on-one. In truth, it was cold calculation. The Wildcat wasn't built to dance with the Zero, so its pilots stopped trying. Instead, they fought on their own terms, turning weakness into strength. The first time Thatch tested his weave in real combat, the results were stunning. What had seemed like a clumsy underdog suddenly revealed teeth, punishing attackers who pressed in too recklessly. The message was clear. America didn't need to outturn the Zero to beat it. All they needed was discipline, coordination, and the courage to trust the tactic. For the Wildcat, this tactical awakening marked the moment it transformed from prey into predator. When the Wildcat first met the Zero in the opening months of 1942, reality was harsh. Over the Philippines and Java, American pilots were still clinging to outdated biplane tactics, turning tightly, trying to duel the nimble Zero at its own game. The result was predictable: devastating losses. To many observers, it seemed to confirm the worst fears. The Wildcat was hopelessly outclassed. But then came Coral Sea, Midway, and the brutal campaign for Guadalcanal. Here, tactics like the Thatch Weave began to take hold. Pilots learned never to dogfight a Zero on equal terms. Instead, they struck quickly, using hit-and-run dives, coordinated pair flying, and the Wildcat's firepower to offset its lack of agility. Slowly, the balance began to shift. Japanese after-action reports noted the change with unease. Suddenly, the clumsy American fighter was refusing to play by the rules. Pilots who thought they had easy targets found themselves ambushed, hammered by .50 caliber gunfire, and facing an opponent that could take hit after hit yet refused to fall. At Henderson Field, the Marines proved just how far things had turned. Flying from a crude strip of dirt carved out of the jungle without proper maintenance or supply, Wildcats achieved a staggering 19-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. The Zero was still elegant, still deadly, but now, every engagement carried risk. For Japanese pilots, the shock was not just physical, but psychological. They began to realize that this ungainly American machine was not dying the way it should, and that realization planted the first seeds of fear. Captured intelligence and later translations of Japanese documents reveal just how drastically perceptions shifted. In early 1942, the Wildcat was officially dismissed as Nikaikyu, a second-rate fighter unworthy of serious concern. Reports mocked its weight, its stubby frame, and even its crank-operated landing gear. For a time, Japanese aces considered it little more than target practice. But by mid-1942, the tone was changing. Internal assessments upgraded the Wildcat to Kai Tsubaki, worthy of caution. After Coral Sea and Midway, and especially following the Marine successes at Guadalcanal, commanders began to note something unsettling. The aircraft itself had not changed, yet its effectiveness had grown. What they had underestimated was not the machine, but the men flying it. Japanese doctrine, steeped in Yamato Damashi, the belief that spirit and honor could overcome material weakness, expected Americans to fight head-to-head. Instead, U.S. pilots broke every rule the Japanese respected. They refused turning duels, flew in disciplined teams, and would disengage when at a disadvantage, only to return moments later from another angle. To Japanese eyes, this looked like cowardice. In reality, it was strategy. By 1943, confidential reports to Japanese squadrons betrayed a reluctant respect. One document described Wildcat pilots as lacking refinement, but possessing mechanical reliability and brutal directness. Another warned, "Do not mistake their pragmatism for weakness. They will sacrifice beauty for victory without hesitation." The shock for Japan was not just that the Wildcat could fight. It was that America had turned a supposed weakness into an unexpected weapon. By late 1943, the Wildcat was gradually giving way to newer fighters like the Hellcat and Corsair. Yet its true legacy was already secure. What began as an underdog had forced Japan to squander its most precious asset, veteran pilots. In just 2 years, the average experience of Japanese naval aviators plummeted from more than 700 pre-war flight hours to less than 200. The Wildcat had done more than hold the line. It had helped break the backbone of Japan's air arm. Its lessons echoed far beyond the Pacific. American designers took note. A fighter did not need to be the fastest or most graceful to win. It needed to be tough, forgiving, and deadly in the hands of a team that understood how to use it. That philosophy, durability over delicacy, strategy over style, remains etched into U.S. Navy doctrine even today. For historians, the shocking truth is not simply that Japan underestimated the Wildcat. It is that they failed to recognize how quickly Americans would adapt, turning paper weakness into battlefield strength. So when one of the few surviving Wildcats takes to the air at an air show today, its growling radial engine is more than a sound of nostalgia. It is a reminder that victory often belongs not to perfection, but to resilience, innovation, and the will to endure. What about you? Do you see the F4F Wildcat as just a stopgap fighter, or as a true legend that struck fear into the pilots of the Zero? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, Don't forget to hit like to support the channel, and make sure to subscribe so you won't miss the next journey into the machines that made history.